Hey guys, tonight we begin with something quieter, more hidden, and much less romantic than popular legends would have you believe. We're stepping into the cold stone walls and silent corridors of a medieval convent. The world of nuns in the Middle Ages wasn't peaceful or idyllic. It was strict, lonely, and full of contradictions. But also, surprisingly, it was powerful in its own quiet way. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of slow and steady deep dive. And let me know in the comments what part of the world you're watching from and how late it is. I always enjoy seeing who's out there with me. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a warm drink or listen with the sound of wind outside, and let's take a slow walk through a day in the life of a medieval nun. Let's start with something simple. Why would someone become a nun in the first place? You might picture a young woman full of faith, choosing a quiet life of prayer and devotion. And yes, that happened sometimes. But more often, becoming a nun wasn't a choice. It was an arrangement, a solution, a decision made by fathers, brothers, or even the local lord, not because of holiness, but because of land, status, or the fact that there were simply too many daughters and not enough dowries to go around. In medieval Europe, a woman with no dowry had limited options. Marriage, if it happened at all, was usually to someone of lower rank or no land. But the church offered an alternative. A daughter could be sent to a convent. It saved the family money, and it gave the girl a roof, food, and something like safety, at least on paper. Girls were sent to nunneries as young as 5 or 6. Some were brought in as oblates, meaning they were promised to the church and raised inside it. Others arrived older, sometimes as widows, sometimes after a scandal, and sometimes simply because there was nowhere else to go. A convent could be a refuge, but it could also be a cage. Life inside was not the peaceful hum of prayer and song you might expect. Yes, there were prayers, lots of them, but there were also rules about everything: when to wake, when to sleep, when to eat, how to speak, what to wear, where to stand, what to think, and how to keep your thoughts quiet enough so that God might approve of them. The rule of Saint Benedict was the backbone of most monastic life. Written in the 6th century, it outlined a strict schedule of work, prayer, and silence. And by the Middle Ages, it had become the standard across many convents. That meant rising before the sun, chanting in Latin before your stomach had a chance to complain, and then hours of labor, reading, and more chanting until the bell rang for bed. Speaking wasn't forbidden, but it was discouraged, especially idle talk. Nuns were supposed to use their voices for prayer, scripture, and nothing else. Silence was seen as a form of discipline, an offering, a way to stay pure. But in practice, it often turned the convent into a place where thoughts echoed a little too loudly, and company never quite reached the soul. And it wasn't always quiet. Not really. Convents were full of the sounds of daily life: scrubbing floors, grinding grain, tending gardens, the coughing of old sisters, the muttering of novices struggling with Latin texts. Life here was lived in small repetitions, stitch by stitch, step by step. Nothing dramatic, nothing fast, just the slow rhythm of devotion measured by bells. Clothing wasn't glamorous. A nun's habit was plain, rough, and often reused for years. Wool in winter, linen in summer if she was lucky. No colors, no decoration. Just the cloth of humility and a veil to remind her that the world outside was no longer hers to enjoy. Beauty wasn't just discouraged, it was erased. Mirrors were rare, perfume unheard of, hair was shaved or hidden. Vanity was a sin, and pride was the quickest way to penance. Meals were simple, usually twice a day. Bread, beans, maybe vegetables from the garden. Meat was rare and often forbidden, except in illness. Fish on holy days. No sweets, no feasts. Just nourishment enough to keep the body going so the soul could keep praying. And you didn't eat in silence because it was peaceful. You ate in silence because someone was reading aloud from Scripture while you chewed. So, if you're picturing a medieval nun as a gentle figure drifting through stone cloisters with her hands clasped in eternal peace, well, that's the myth. The truth was harder and much colder. But oddly enough, for some, it was also a kind of freedom. Freedom might seem like a strange word to use here. After all, convent walls were thick, the rules were strict, and the outside world wasn't exactly forbidden, but it wasn't welcomed either. Leaving was nearly impossible. Once you took vows, that was it. Your life was sealed like parchment under wax. But for some women, that was still more freedom than the world outside ever offered. In the wider world, women had roles: daughters, wives, mothers, widows, and each role came with expectations, limitations, and usually someone else in control. Fathers decided marriages, husbands decided everything else. But inside a convent, a woman could read, a woman could write, a woman could lead. There were abbesses with more power than most village lords. There were sisters who copied manuscripts, ran schools, managed estates, and negotiated with bishops. Of course, not every nun became an abbess. Most never rose past novice or lay sister. But even so, in a world where most women were expected to obey without question, the convent offered something quieter, but more radical: the chance to be heard, even if the only one listening was God. And there were voices. Many nuns wrote, not books of poetry or tales of adventure, but letters, meditations, sometimes visions. Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most famous nuns of the 12th century, claimed to hear the voice of God in bright flashes of light. She wrote music, science, and theology, all from within the walls of her convent. Her writings were sent to kings and popes. She was a woman in a habit, but her voice reached across empires. Not all convents were equal, of course. Some were wealthy, built with stone and funded by noble families. They had scriptoriums, gardens, even servants. Others were poor, wooden buildings, cold cells, sisters who worked in the fields by day and stitched their habits back together by candlelight. But whether rich or poor, life followed the same rhythm: prayer, work, silence, reflection. And always there was the presence of God, or at least the idea of Him. Nuns were brides of Christ. That was more than just a metaphor. Ceremonies were held where new novices were dressed like brides, given wedding rings, and symbolically married to Jesus. It was meant to be holy, but for some it was confusing, especially for those who had never chosen this life in the first place. Doubt wasn't allowed, but it existed, hidden beneath layers of guilt and penance. A girl sent to the convent at 10, who became a nun at 16, might never have known another life. But that didn't mean she never wondered. What if? What if the world outside wasn't as sinful as they said? What if marriage wasn't shameful? What if God was listening but not speaking back? The answer, according to her confessor, was prayer. Always more prayer, prayer for strength, prayer for clarity, prayer for the sin of asking questions. But faith in the Middle Ages was not about clarity. It was about obedience. The more silent you became, the closer to God you were believed to be. Some nuns embraced that silence, others endured it, and some broke under it. There were stories of mystics who fasted until they collapsed, who saw visions during long nights without sleep, who bled during prayer or claimed to feel the wounds of Christ. These women were praised, sometimes feared, and occasionally investigated, because holiness in excess looked a lot like madness. But in a world where women had few ways to speak with authority, visions gave them a voice, a dangerous voice. If God was truly speaking through them, then even bishops had to listen. So convents walked a fine line between devotion and hysteria, between order and chaos, between divine inspiration and something harder to explain. Not every nun was a mystic. Most weren't. Most just lived. They planted herbs. They cared for the sick. They mended torn sleeves and sang the same psalms every morning until the words wore grooves into their minds. They aged in silence. They died in silence. And sometimes they were buried without names, just crosses over earth that no one visited except the gardener. But they also laughed, quietly, carefully, in the kitchens, in the laundry rooms, when the bell rang late and no one could find the abbot's keys. Life in the convent wasn't joyless. It just didn't show joy the way others did. No dancing, no parties, no wine-soaked songs around a fire. But there was peace, sometimes, and that peace, hard-earned and often incomplete, was the best some would ever know. If peace was rare, it was because the convent never really stopped. From the outside, the walls suggested stillness, gray stone, narrow windows, no laughter drifting over the fields. But inside, life ticked forward with mechanical devotion. The bell was everything. It rang before dawn, summoning bleary-eyed sisters to the chapel in silence. It rang again for prime, then terce, then sext, like a divine heartbeat marking the passing of each sacred hour. A nun's day was not measured in tasks, but in prayer. Even weeding a garden or sweeping the floor was less a chore and more a liturgy repeated with hands instead of words. The chapel itself was not grand. It was cold mostly, unadorned. The air always smelled faintly of wax, dust, and wet cloth. Rows of wooden stalls lined the walls, and in each a sister stood or knelt, whispering Latin verses in monotone harmony. The sound was not beautiful in the way choirs are beautiful. It was steadier than that, like wind moving through reeds. Sometimes it faltered when one sister forgot a line or another drifted into sleep. But no one corrected her aloud. Correction came with a glance, a pause in the rhythm. Then the verse continued. Scripture readings filled much of the morning. A rotating schedule assigned different sisters to read aloud while the rest listened, heads bowed, eyes closed. But listening didn't always mean hearing. Fatigue clouded attention. Words blurred. Stories repeated. Psalms became background noise against the scrape of bread crust or the ache in a joint that had not bent easily since winter. Still, none dared to yawn. Every gesture was watched. Reverence was expected, even if the mind had wandered far beyond the page. Outside prayer, labor took many forms. The convent, like most in the countryside, was self-sustaining. Gardens had to be kept, hens fed, grain ground, wool carded. Every nun was assigned a duty, and though rank dictated the easier tasks, no one escaped work entirely. Even the abbess, seated high at meals and cloaked in more layers than the others, occasionally rolled herbs in her hands or stitched repairs into torn altar cloths. And while silence was observed, the workrooms were not devoid of life. A cough here, a dropped spindle, the gentle rhythm of cloth being beaten clean. Even silence had texture. Young novices were always easy to spot, their steps too quick, eyes too wide, hands uncertain around the simplest chores. Some arrived full of devotion, already certain they were chosen for a higher path. Others carried reluctance like a stone in their stomach. Their fingers fidgeted. Their eyes lingered on windows. They had not yet learned how to disappear into the pattern. But the pattern would claim them in time. Days in a convent were not just repetitive. They were consuming. Time folded in on itself. A novice who struggled on her first week would, within months, speak like her elders, move with the same economy, and no longer flinch when the bell sounded before the sun had risen. There were rules for everything, but not all were written. A glance could mean more than a sentence. Favor was subtle, punishment quieter still. Public reprimands were rare. Shame worked better in silence. A sister caught whispering after Compline would find herself sweeping the courtyard alone the next morning. No one spoke of it, but everyone noticed, and that noticing, that quiet communal observation, shaped behavior more efficiently than scoldings ever could. At meals, food was served in bowls without handles. Bread was passed by hand, rarely enough to fill the belly. Water, never wine, unless it was a feast day. But even feasts were muted. No dancing, no extra portions, just a change in readings, and maybe the rare treat of cheese or fruit. Conversations were not allowed, but eyes spoke. A raised brow, a faint smile, approval, disapproval, questions, answers, all passed invisibly across the long wooden table as Scripture continued to echo in the background. And yet, despite the rules, despite the silences, despite the daily weight of repetition, bonds formed, not loudly, not in the way friends bond over jokes or shared mischief, but in shared ritual, in the quiet way two sisters might kneel beside each other each morning, year after year, without ever speaking of the comfort found in proximity. There was connection, just not named as such, and in the strange geometry of convent life, connection was allowed, as long as it stayed invisible. There were seasons in the convent, though not always the ones marked on a calendar. Of course the sisters tracked the months: Easter, Advent, Lent, the feast of St. Agnes, the feast of St. Scholastica. The liturgical year was the only year that truly mattered, but the seasons that shaped a nun's life were different. There was the season when the well froze and water had to be hauled with cracked hands and quiet prayers that the rope wouldn't snap. There was the season of illness, when coughing echoed through the dormitory like the bells at matins. There was the season of novices, when new faces tried to fit themselves into old habits, and the season of death, which came quietly, sometimes twice in a week, and left behind a freshly dug mound just outside the wall. Death in the convent was not treated with fear. It was accepted like everything else. Sisters did not wail. They did not protest. They washed the body, clothed it in linen, laid it out beside a candle, and recited the prayers. It was said that to die in the habit was to go directly into the arms of Christ. And yet, even in this belief, there were moments of hesitation. A young sister, too pale for too long, an older one who no longer knelt at the correct times. Death arrived slowly, and everyone saw it coming, but no one said its name. Not all sisters made it to old age. Illness took some, accidents others, and once, rarely but memorably, madness. There was the tale of Sister Almoda, remembered not for sainthood or piety, but for the night she wandered into the chapel at Lauds and refused to speak. Her mouth never opened again. She stood still through prayers, through meals, through years, until she simply stopped standing. No one ever said what truly happened. Some called it divine silence. Others whispered about possession, though never where the abbess might hear. Madness was inconvenient. It could not be punished like pride or corrected like error. It unsettled the order of things, and order was sacred. Every sister had her place, her stall, her seat in the refectory, her task in the garden. There was safety in knowing where to be and when. To step out of that was to step into uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous. Rules were copied by hand in ink that stained fingers. The rule of St. Benedict was not just a text, it was a way of breathing, and though every convent interpreted it differently, the bones remained the same: obedience, stability, and conversion of life. To obey without question, to remain in one place forever, to turn every moment into an offering. These were not requests, they were expectations. Not everyone met them, but failure did not come with drama. It came with silence. A sister who broke a vow might be barred from the Eucharist. She might be assigned penance, such as fasting or extended silence. She might, in severe cases, be separated from the others, not imprisoned, just set apart. In a life where companionship was measured in shared silence, isolation became a sharper punishment than words could ever deliver. There was no formal education for most women in the outside world, but inside the convent, literacy was both common and expected. Nuns read scripture, they copied texts, they memorized prayers in Latin, even if they could not translate them. Books were few but precious, kept in armaria, small wooden cupboards locked by iron keys that hung from the abbess's belt. Opening one was an event. The smell of parchment, the careful turning of pages, the whispered reverence for every line, even the ones that made little sense. Sometimes, if a convent was wealthy, the sisters illuminated manuscripts, gold leaf pressed into vellum with fingers that shook from cold, margins filled with curling vines and ink animals, not for decoration, but as devotion. Each letter was a prayer, each flourish an offering. No one signed their name. These books were not for glory. They were for God, and when finished, they were returned to the cupboard and rarely touched again. Still, among the sisters, a few names lived on, not in writing, but in memory. Sister Clara, who copied the Gospels with such clarity that visiting monks asked to see her hand. Sister Beatrice, who taught 4 generations of novices to chant the Psalms without stumbling. Sister Agnes, who nursed the sick with a patience that never cracked. They were not famous, but their presence lingered like warmth from a fire long after it had gone out. Some convents stood close to villages, and though their walls were meant to divide the sacred from the secular, the border was not always clean. Farmers brought offerings of grain. Mothers brought daughters in the hope that their silence might shape them into saints. Sometimes the baker's boy was sent to deliver bread and left red-faced after making eye contact with a young novice through the cloister gate. These encounters were brief, wordless, but they reminded the sisters that the world continued just beyond the hedges, that life went on, loud and unscripted, without the rhythm of bells to hold it in place. The abbess watched everything. She was not young. She had lived within the walls long enough to feel the stones shifting beneath her steps in ways no one else noticed. Her gaze was quiet but heavy, like the air before a storm. She knew which sisters prayed sincerely and which ones counted verses without listening. She knew which novice cried into her blanket and which one looked too long at the gate. Her power was soft but absolute. She assigned duties. She mediated disputes. She decided when a penance had been fulfilled or when a confession needed to be repeated. And when she passed through the halls, every voice stilled, every back straightened. Not every abbess was kind. Some were chosen for their lineage, others for their ability to manage property and keep the convent out of debt. Piety was expected, but administration was essential. A convent was not just a place of prayer, it was a functioning estate. Land needed to be leased, grain counted, taxes paid, and so the abbess balanced accounts with the same care she gave to the Psalms. Her desk held both scripture and ledgers, and she moved between them without hesitation. Visitors were rare, but not forbidden. A bishop might arrive once a year, cloaked in authority and surrounded by young clerics who could not meet the sisters' eyes. His presence meant inspection, questions, a special mass, sometimes a sermon about modesty and obedience, as if the women kneeling before him had not already sacrificed everything for those very virtues. Afterward, the visitors left quickly, uneasy in the presence of so many veiled faces that stared without blinking, that responded in practiced chant instead of common speech. There were also priests, some assigned permanently, others rotating between parishes. They came to hear confessions, to offer Mass, to bring the sacraments that no woman, however holy, could consecrate. Their power was unshakable, but that did not mean their presence was welcomed. Some were kind, others condescending, and all knew that their voice would always be louder than any sister's, no matter how long she had worn the habit. Confession was required, weekly, sometimes more. The act was simple but heavy. Kneeling, whispering sins through a screen, waiting for silence. Then the voice, telling you how many prayers would cleanse what you had done or thought or failed to feel, and always, always ending with absolution. The slate wiped clean, at least until the next bell, the next breath, the next doubt. But not all sins were spoken. Some were swallowed, buried, left unnamed, because naming them might make them real. A dream that lingered too long, a memory that arrived in the middle of prayer, a bitterness toward a sister who always sang off-key. The rules did not account for these, and so they lived quietly, like dust in the corners of a cell that never quite got swept. There was no privacy, not really. Sleep was taken in rows, in narrow wooden beds, each with a thin blanket and a harder pillow. The air in the dormitory was stale by morning, filled with breath and dreams no one admitted to having. Waking came with a bell, and no matter how broken the night, you rose. There was no luxury of rest. Fatigue was part of devotion. Suffering without complaint was holy. And yet, in the moments just before dawn, when the sky began to soften and the world had not yet found its voice, there was something almost gentle, a stillness that wrapped around the convent like linen. For a brief moment, the silence was not heavy. it was shelter. And even the oldest sisters, bent with time and ritual, would close their eyes and breathe it in as if it were the only comfort left in the world. Comfort was not a word often spoken aloud, but it existed in small forms, in a warm cup of broth passed between fingers, numb from prayer, in the weight of a wool cloak shared without asking, in the way one sister might adjust the veil of another when the wind had pulled it loose. No one wrote these moments down. They were not praised. They were not taught. But they mattered. In a life defined by structure and restraint, kindness arrived in fragments. Punishment, on the other hand, was visible, not cruel, but firm. A sister who arrived late to prayer stood during the next meal. One who forgot her reading was given extra time in the garden, regardless of weather. Public error was treated with public silence. No scolding, no raised voices, just absence where presence had been expected, and that absence spoke louder than any rebuke. There were stories passed between the older sisters, stories of saints who had once lived behind the same walls, of miracles too small for books but too strange to forget. A candle that never burned out, a novice who heard the Virgin's voice in the wind, a sister who bled from the palms during Lent and left no mark afterward. The truth of these tales was not the point. They were remembered because belief itself was an act of devotion. Whether or not the miracles happened did not matter. What mattered was the willingness to listen. Pilgrims sometimes appeared at the gate, tired, hungry, wrapped in cloaks, stiff with dust and rain. They were given bread and a place to sleep in the outer hall. Never inside the convent, of course, but near enough to feel its hush. In the morning they moved on. Their stories stayed. One had seen Jerusalem. Another had survived a shipwreck by clutching a saint's relic. Another claimed to have walked barefoot across 3 kingdoms. The sisters listened in silence, and when the doors closed again, they returned to prayer with images of distant cities they would never see. The world beyond the walls changed. Wars came and went. Kings died. Plagues rolled in waves over the land, turning cities into graveyards. Rumors arrived like birds, too quick to catch and too vague to confirm. A sister's cousin had perished. A nearby town had emptied overnight. The bishop would not visit again this year. But inside the convent, the bell still rang. The psalms were still sung. The garden still yielded bitter greens and stubborn roots. In the face of so much motion, the stillness of the convent became its own kind of resistance. Not all visitors were pilgrims. Sometimes young girls were brought to the gate by fathers who spoke too quickly, or mothers who would not meet the abbess's eyes. They were handed over with gifts, promises, apologies. The girl would stand in the entry, clutching a bundle of linen and bread, and try not to cry. Some had been told they were chosen. Others knew better. Their names would be entered in the book, their clothes replaced with the novice's habit, their hair cut slowly, in silence, the strands falling to the floor like petals. It was said that to shed one's hair was to shed vanity, to remove temptation, to step away from the world and into the arms of God. But for the girl watching her braid fall, it felt like loss, not of beauty, but of memory, of childhood, of the last piece of herself that had not yet been taken. Training began immediately. Prayer, discipline, posture, how to walk without noise, how to speak only when addressed, how to listen without reacting. Some learned quickly, others struggled, a few tried to run. The outer gate was locked. Even if they reached it, there was no path home. Their vows were not yet final, but the road back rarely opened once it had closed. Yet over time most settled. Their voices joined the chants. Their hands found rhythm in the gardens. They began to dream less of escape and more of understanding. What had once felt like captivity became familiarity. Not freedom, perhaps, but not fear either. In the rigid life of the convent, routine did not only restrict, it comforted. Pain dulled, desire quieted, and in the long hours between bells, the girls became women, and the women became still. Stillness was not the same as peace. There were days when the silence pressed too tightly, when the chapel felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary, when prayers clung to the tongue like ash. Faith, for many, was not a constant fire. It flickered, it dimmed, it returned. The sisters did not speak of doubt, not because they were forbidden, but because they did not have the words. Doubt was a shadow that each carried alone, stitched beneath the habit like a second skin. Some sought guidance, a quiet word with the abbess, a longer confession, a question whispered in the garden with another sister whose voice held steadiness. Others kept their thoughts locked behind their eyes. They moved through the hours with practiced grace, even as their minds wandered to questions they had been taught not to ask. Not every doubt was sinful, but not every answer came. Dreams were rarely spoken of. In a place so shaped by ritual and rule, the inner world remained private. But dreams came anyway, of family, of songs half remembered, of paths that led nowhere. Sometimes a sister woke with tears on her cheeks and said nothing. The others noticed, but did not ask. Comfort was offered in silence. A hand brushed against a sleeve, an extra piece of bread placed beside her bowl. These small gestures said everything. The changing of seasons marked time better than the calendar. Spring brought new novices and muddy floors. Summer filled the garden with scent and sweat. Autumn came with the heavy hush of harvest and the careful storing of root vegetables in the cellar. Winter brought cold that no cloak could banish, and prayers whispered through chattering teeth. Through it all, the rhythm did not change. The bell continued. The chants continued. The sisters, wrapped in layers and silence, continued. Sometimes there were celebrations, not loud, not indulgent, but real. The feast of a patron saint, the anniversary of the convent's founding, the elevation of a sister to a new rank. These events brought changes, a slightly fuller meal, a song sung with more vigor, a smile allowed to linger. Joy here was quiet, but it existed. It threaded itself into the corners of life where no one thought to look. Illness was a frequent visitor. Cold rooms, hard labor, thin meals, bodies wore down, coughs that never quite faded, joints that refused to bend, eyes that dimmed too early. The infirmary was a small room with whitewashed walls and a shelf of tinctures labeled in fading ink. Sisters took turns tending the sick, learning which teas soothed the belly, which compresses reduced fever. They learned to recognize the scent of death before the final breath. To care for the ill was a privilege, not because it brought glory, but because it required patience. It demanded presence. The sick could not hide, nor could their caretakers. It was the only place where silence broke, where words, soft and few, were allowed. A whispered prayer, a name spoken gently, a memory shared in the hope it might offer comfort before the end. When a sister died, her bed was left empty for a week, her place in the chapel unfilled, her bowl untouched. It was not superstition, it was remembrance, a way of acknowledging the space she had held and the silence she left behind. Then, after 7 days, another sister quietly took her place. The rhythm resumed. The bell did not pause. The psalms continued. Some left not through death, but by choice. Rare, but not unknown. A sister who had not yet taken final vows could ask to leave. The abbess might approve or not. If permitted, she was given clothes, a small sum, and escorted to the edge of the village. She left alone. The gate closed. Her name was not erased, but no longer spoken, not in anger, just as a way of protecting the shape the convent had returned to. Inside, the sisters never asked what happened to those who left, whether they married, whether they regretted, whether they looked back. Their stories remained unfinished, folded quietly behind the others. The convent did not keep records of absence. It held fast to what remained. Through all this, time softened the edges of identity. The girl who had arrived in tears became the woman who corrected chance with a glance. The novice who once flinched at the bell became the one who rang it each morning. Names blurred, stories overlapped, but the structure held. And within that structure, lives were lived not loudly, but fully. Not every sister arrived as a child. Some came later, after their lives beyond the wall had already unfolded. Widows, women without dowries, daughters of minor nobility seeking refuge after scandal. They entered through the same gate, offered the same vows, wore the same habit, but their eyes held different things. Knowledge of the world, of laughter and grief, and the weight of choices made outside the reach of the abbess's approval. The younger sisters watched them carefully. There was mystery in a woman who had once worn silk or spoken to men without lowering her gaze. But in time, the veil equalized. The days did not care where a woman had come from. They only cared whether she obeyed, whether she rose with the bell, whether she knelt with the others and sang the psalms in rhythm, without pride, without hesitation. There were few mirrors in the convent, a polished metal disc in the infirmary, a basin of still water near the washing place. Reflection was not encouraged. Vanity, even in thought, was discouraged. Beauty faded. That was the lesson. And yet some sisters remembered. The feel of hair combed before a feast, the weight of a ring that no longer circled their finger, the brush of a breeze against a bare neck in summer. These memories did not vanish. They only quieted. Silence was not the absence of sound. It was a presence in itself. It filled the halls, the cells, the long corridors where footsteps echoed softly. It taught the sisters to listen differently, to hear the rustle of a habit in motion, the shift of a bench during prayer, the breath of the woman beside them during vigil. Words were used, but sparingly. Meaning was passed through gestures, glances, the rhythm of shared work. The garden was one of the few places where silence eased. While tending vegetables, sisters sometimes hummed under their breath. The abbess allowed it. Hands in soil seemed to soften the rules. Here, among roots and herbs and the careful coaxing of stubborn plants, voices returned briefly. A comment about the weather, a suggestion for where to move the trellis. These were small allowances, but they mattered. The garden also served the infirmary. Elder sisters knew which plants calmed a fever and which should never be touched without gloves. They passed this knowledge in whispers, names of herbs muttered like secrets, marigold for wounds, yarrow for bleeding, sage for coughs, poppy only with permission. To prepare these medicines was a sacred task, not because of their power, but because of their purpose. To lessen pain was to serve God. Winter tested the convent most. The cold pressed in through the stone walls. Frost laced the edges of the windows. Breath curled in clouds before the altar. The sisters layered garments over their habits, but the chill still reached fingers and toes. Fires were lit only when necessary. Wood was precious, and the smoke from damp logs often filled the halls more than the warmth. Yet winter also brought stillness that felt deeper. The chapel seemed quieter, the prayers more solemn, the hours longer. Snow muffled the outside world, and for a time the convent felt more separate than ever, a world within a world, untouched, frozen, waiting. In the long nights, some sisters embroidered. By candlelight, with aching eyes, they traced thread into linen, crosses, doves, wheat. The symbols were simple, but their placement careful. Each stitch made in silence, each design planned not for beauty, but for reverence. These cloths were used in the chapel, draped over the altar, folded with care, never praised, but always noticed. Once, during a particularly hard winter, the convent lost power to grind its grain. The mill had frozen, the river stopped. The sisters turned to older methods, handstones, mortars, and pestles. Each meal required hours. Arms ached, backs bent. But no one complained. Hunger did not make them louder, only more determined. Bread was thinner that season, soup more plain, but it was shared evenly, quietly, without fuss. Scarcity was not unfamiliar. The convent knew how to live with less. Fewer candles, fewer blankets, fewer visits from the outside world. But even in that lack, there was no sense of punishment, only discipline, the kind that does not shout. The turning points were often quiet, not a revelation in the chapel or drama in the garden. Instead, it came in a moment, a sister pausing at her stall when the bell rang early, realizing her voice had joined the others without thought, or a novice noticing the bread she broke felt more soothing than before, or the abbess slipping a hand to steady one of the younger sisters during matins without a word. These small moments marked change. They reminded the sisters that time in the convent was not just measured by days or seasons, but by inner shifts that no one else might see. Relationships formed slowly. The abbess and her council occasionally walked together in the cloister. Two sisters might share duties in the infirmary in silence for years before noticing the comfort of familiarity in the rhythm of tasks. Bonds were not declared. They were understood, seen in the way one sister might leave an extra sheaf of wood by another's bed, or in the care taken when folding a habit to ensure the collar lay straight. These gestures were invisible to outsiders, but within the convent they held meaning. The more time passed, the more the convent felt less like a prison and more like a second skin. Walls became friends. They held back the wind, muffled storms, whispered stories of generations. The worn stone steps told the weight of countless feet. The chapel benches curved slightly from decades of kneeling backs. This familiarity gave comfort. It also bound the sisters together. Silence deepened in some moments. During a midday break, the garden grew still. Even birds seemed to pause. The sun warmed the stones, and the sisters would stop and let the heat soak into bones tired from work and worship. No one spoke. They only stood, leaning on spade or rake, breathing in the hush that spoke of endurance and acceptance. Then came the Feast of the Holy Cross, one of the few days when the rhythm shifted. Candles were plentiful, gloves removed so sisters could place flowers at the altar, a single, simple hymn, sung with slightly fuller voices. Food was modestly richer, a little cheese, figs if they could be found, warm broth that felt like a blessing on the tongue. The day felt different, not free, but lighter, as if the daily structure had remembered why it existed. This feast reminded them that, though the habit looked alike, each sister carried something personal inside: memory, loss, faith, doubt. But for a day, those things seemed to shrink. The chapel glowed. The sisters lined up with a small sense of shared purpose beyond obedience. Eyes met. Smiles were allowed. The habit did nothing to hide the humanity beneath. Still, at the end of the feast, quiet returned. Candles dwindled. The cellar emptied slightly. Footsteps resumed. The bell sounded again, but the difference lingered. A sister might smooth her veil a second longer that night, or pause on the stairs, looking at the lavender plants she would harvest in the morning. The day had changed her, just a little. Not all sisters felt the same shift. Some greeted the return to routine with relief. It was what they had trained for. Others felt a pull, an echo of life outside that felt distant, yet persistent. A question they did not ask: what if this were not their life? And then the bell would strike, and they would kneel. But on that night, taught by candles and ceremony, many felt the walls less like walls. They felt like shelter, a place made by many small practices, many small kindnesses, many days stitched together, a place made over time. And time itself was a teacher. It showed that the accumulation of small moments mattered more than any grand event, that constancy was a kind of miracle, that silence could be full, that a single hymn could carry more weight than years of unspoken reflection. That life, lived fully, did not need to be loud. The bell that marked the middle of the night was the loneliest. It broke sleep in its softest form. A single toll, then silence. The sisters rose in the dark, moving by memory, not light. The chapel was cold, lit by one candle at the altar. Each step echoed in stone. No one spoke. This was the hour of deepest stillness, when even dreams faded. The vigil belonged to God alone. Some sisters struggled with this hour, their eyes blurred with sleep, their bodies shivered against the cold. Yet they knelt, shoulders touching lightly. They sang psalms they had repeated 100 times, and still the words felt both familiar and distant. The night did not offer answers. It offered presence, to stay awake with intention, to sit in the quiet and say, without speaking, that they would not turn away. When the bell sounded again, the sisters returned to their cells. Some fell asleep quickly. Others lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, counting heartbeats. In the distance, an owl called. The wind sighed against the stone walls. Outside the cloister, the world was still dark. But inside, the next day had already begun. By morning, the rhythm resumed. The convent was a place of endless repetition, but that repetition was never hollow. There was meaning in each task. Even the sweeping of the cloister carried weight. The bristles of the broom on stone, the line of dust gathered and carried away. The act of cleaning was a kind of prayer, a way to order the world, even if only for a moment. Meals were taken in silence. A single sister read aloud from Scripture or from the lives of the saints. Her voice was steady, unhurried. The others listened while chewing bread, sipping broth. Stories of martyrdom, of grace, of temptation overcome. These stories became part of them, not as inspiration, but as rhythm, as background sound to the motion of spoons and bowls and the creak of benches beneath them. After meals, there was work. Some returned to the gardens, others to the laundry house, a few to the scriptorium, where ink-stained fingers copied texts in cramped, careful letters. Every word mattered. Each stroke of the quill was part of a lineage that stretched backward through generations. Even the dullest sentence felt important. It had survived long enough to be copied. That survival meant something. In the laundry, sisters worked in pairs, scrubbing cloth against boards, wringing water from habits grown stiff with wear. The scent of soap hung in the air. Steam rose in thin clouds. Hands turned red from cold water. But there was ease in the motion, repetition giving rest to the mind. Eyes met across the tubs, a nod, a shared moment of understanding. The abbess passed through each place once a day, not to scold, not to praise, simply to observe. Her presence was steady, expected. She did not interrupt, but her eyes missed nothing. She knew which sister had slept poorly, which novice needed guidance, which rule might need to be spoken again, gently. She ruled not with fear, but with presence. Her silence spoke more than any command. Some days there were visitors from the outside, a priest delivering a message, a merchant offering trade, a mother bringing news of a family death. These moments broke the rhythm, but only briefly. The sisters watched from a distance, their hands still moving through their tasks. The world outside no longer felt like theirs. It moved too fast, spoke too loud, carried stories they no longer understood. Once the gate closed again, the convent felt more itself, as though it had exhaled. The sisters returned to their duties, reassured by the return to quiet. The world would continue, but so would they, in the folds of their habits, in the rows of vegetables, in the silent turning of pages in the scriptorium. Their lives were not invisible, only steady, and in that steadiness there was something unshakable. The convent had rules for everything: how to enter the chapel, how to clean the bowls, how to fold the habit at night. These rules were not questioned. They were accepted, as air is accepted, or gravity. No one explained why a candle must be lit before a psalm, or why silence must be held between bells. These things simply were. Over time, the rules became reflex. A sister did not think about kneeling before prayer. She simply knelt. Yet beneath the order, life was not without tension. There were disagreements, not loud, not lasting, but real. A novice who left her book open on the bench, a sister who hummed a tune too often, a task done poorly, then corrected without acknowledgement. These small frictions passed quickly, rarely spoken of, but they shaped the days as wind shapes stone, quietly, over time. The abbess held final word in all things, but her power rested not in force, nor in fear. It rested in stillness, in knowing, in remembering. She knew the history of the convent, the names of those buried in the garden, the prayers for each season. She spoke little, but when she did, every sister listened, not because she was loud, but because her voice carried weight, born of years and of silence well kept. Confession was part of the rhythm. Each sister, once a week, knelt before the priest who served the convent. He came from the nearby village, his visits predictable. He sat in a small wooden booth beside the chapel, listening as the sisters whispered their failings: impatience, distraction, pride. The sins were often small, but never dismissed. Each was met with calm instruction, a psalm to repeat, a silence to observe, a reminder of humility. For some, confession brought comfort, a place to lay down the weight of thought. For others, it stirred more questions. Was forgetting a line during prayer a sin? Was thinking of family during vigil wrong? The answers varied, but the act itself remained. Regular, expected, a space carved from the week for examination, not of others, but of self. There were days of retreat, chosen by the abbess, days when no tasks were assigned, when no work was done beyond what was necessary. These were not holidays. They were days of inwardness, of long hours in the chapel, of psalms sung softer, of walks taken alone through the cloister with eyes lowered. These days passed slowly, but they offered something else, a sense of return. In the chapter house, decisions were made. Not all rules came from the abbess alone. The elders met once each month. They sat in a circle, robes rustling, hands folded. Topics were raised gently: a change to the garden routine, a request for new ink, a question about allowing a novice more time before vows. Votes were cast in silence. Agreement was assumed unless stated otherwise. Debate, when it happened, was brief, respectful. The structure allowed for listening. Young novices watched these meetings from the edge of the room, learning without being taught. They saw how a sister spoke with care, how disagreement could be offered without offense. These were lessons not written in the rule book, but lived. Over time, the novices would become the elders. They would sit in the circle. Their voices would one day matter in the same way. Seasons changed, but the rhythm did not. The bell did not ring differently in spring than in autumn. Yet the world around the convent shifted. Flowers returned to the garden. Snow melted from the roof tiles. Birds sang louder. Insects buzzed near the herbs. The sisters adjusted their tasks, but not their hours. Life continued, rooted in routine. Evenings brought a kind of stillness unique to that hour. The final prayer said, the last bell rung, robes folded, doors closed, the flicker of a candle in each cell, a bowl of water near the bed, a soft breath drawn before sleep. These were moments not recorded, not spoken of, but they were real. They held weight. In them, each sister found her own way back to the center of the life she had chosen. Not every sister stayed. Some left before their final vows. The reasons were never discussed openly, but everyone noticed when a cell stood empty. A novice who had arrived wide-eyed and soft-spoken might one day be gone by morning, her belongings folded neatly, her robe placed on the bench. No farewell, only absence. The abbess would say a prayer, the others would bow their heads, and then the rhythm resumed. Leaving was rare. Most who entered the convent remained. Their reasons for staying were not always clear, even to themselves. For some, it was faith. For others, shelter. For a few, it was the absence of other paths. Over time, the reason mattered less than the choice. To stay was to commit, to enter fully into the rhythm, into the quiet, into the long unfolding of a life marked not by events, but by hours. A sister's vows bound her in more than words: poverty, chastity, obedience. Each vow shaped the self in different ways. Poverty stripped away possession, but also envy. Chastity removed distraction, but also longing. Obedience took away choice, but gave clarity. These were not just promises, they were frameworks, the structure through which each sister rebuilt herself, piece by quiet piece. There were moments of doubt, always, a sleepless night, a psalm repeated without feeling, a memory of a voice long forgotten. These moments passed quietly like shadows on the chapel wall. They were not spoken of often, but they were shared. Every sister had them. Some admitted it with a glance, others with a pause before prayer, but all understood. Illness was part of life in the convent. It arrived without warning, a cough that lingered, a fever that rose, a wound that would not heal. The infirmary held herbs and cloths, and water boiled over a slow fire. The eldest sisters cared for the sick. They moved without panic, their hands steady, their eyes clear. They knew what to do and when to pray instead. Death, when it came quietly. There was no ceremony beyond the prayers. The body was washed, the habit cleaned. A candle burned through the night. The burial took place at dawn. The sisters stood together in the garden, robes dark against the pale sky. One psalm was sung, then silence. The earth was returned. The rhythm continued. It always continued. Some said that the dead never truly left, that their steps still echoed in the cloister, that their voices hummed faintly in the chapel's corners. These stories were not encouraged, but they were not denied either. Memory lived in the walls, in the habits passed down, in the pages of a book copied by a hand now gone. The past was not forgotten. It was folded into the present, like thread into cloth. Severe winters made everything slower. Fires struggled to warm the cells. Water froze in the basins. Breath clouded the air during prayer. But no one complained. Scarves were worn beneath hoods, extra layers sewn in silence. Even the bells rang a little duller in the snow, but they rang, always, calling the sisters to rise, to gather, to kneel. The convent had few visitors in winter. The roads were poor, the wind sharp. Messages arrived by foot, carried by men with cloaks thick as carpets. They left quickly, their boots dripping on the stone. A few coins exchanged, a name spoken, a nod. Then the gate closed again. The quiet returned. The rhythm held. By spring, the ground softened. Shoots of green appeared along the edges of the garden. Herbs planted with care began to push through the soil. The sisters worked longer in the sun, dirt on their hands, sweat on their brows. They did not speak often, but their movements said enough. The earth responded to care, to patience, to time given without expectation. Birds nested in the eaves. Bees returned to the hives. The scent of lavender carried through the courtyard. Life outside the cloister moved quickly, but within the convent, time remained folded, slow, even, measured in footsteps and bells and the rustle of habits in motion. There were times when the silence of the convent became so complete that it almost seemed to press against the skin, as if the very air had weight. In those moments, a sister might feel as though she were drifting slightly apart from the world she inhabited, no longer fully tethered to the stone beneath her feet or the linen wrapped around her shoulders. Yet this detachment was not frightening. It was familiar expected, something spoken of only in brief, indirect terms by those who had lived long enough within the cloister to understand its subtleties. It was part of the life they had chosen, not escape, but surrender, not distance, but elevation. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the residue of prayer and the echoes of footsteps worn into the flagstones by generations of women who had passed before. Though the days within the convent rarely changed, the passage of time marked itself in ways that were quiet but undeniable. A sister's face would gather lines where once there had been smoothness. Her stride would slow slightly. Her voice, during chant, would soften at the higher notes. These were not seen as signs of decline. They were signs of integration, of having given oneself fully to the rhythm. A young novice might look at an elder sister and wonder what she had once been like before the convent walls closed behind her. But the answer, always, was the same. She had been what the rhythm had made her. Life within the convent was not isolated from all forms of knowledge. Though rarely discussed, the abbess maintained correspondence with other houses, sometimes even beyond the region. Messages arrived folded carefully, written in Latin or, more rarely, in a mix of Latin and the vernacular. These messages brought reports of famines, edicts, disputes over land, or the naming of a new bishop. The contents were not read aloud to the sisters, but their arrival signaled that the world outside still moved in patterns both predictable and sharp. The convent did not ignore the world. It simply did not allow itself to be governed by it. There were also letters sent by families. Some arrived asking about a daughter who had not written. Others offered updates on the health of a father, the marriage of a brother, or the birth of a niece. These were read aloud privately to the sisters they concerned, then folded and kept in small wooden boxes, wrapped in cloth. A sister was allowed to reread them during moments of personal reflection, though never during the hours set aside for work or prayer. The outside world, even in written form, was a privilege, not a right. Festivals from the church calendar brought small changes to the routine, though even these were restrained. The feast of St. Benedict, for example, was marked by longer services, more candles lit in the chapel, and a rare sweet added to the evening meal, perhaps a bit of honey on bread or fruit soaked in wine. The atmosphere on such days was not one of celebration in the worldly sense, but of deepened reverence. Songs were sung with slightly more force. Prayers were said with fuller breath. Each sister moved as she always had, but with a subtle shift in intention, as if the memory of the saint had passed like a hand across her shoulders. On occasion, a bishop would visit. These visits were brief but significant. The sisters would prepare by scrubbing the floors until they shone with dull polish, pressing their robes until the folds sat straight along the seams, and rehearsing their chant so that each voice fell into place without hesitation. The bishop would be welcomed in the chapter house, seated on a chair slightly raised, and offered modest hospitality. His presence reminded them of their place within the larger framework of the church. But when he left, the convent seemed to breathe out, relieved to return to its own quiet governance, to the rule they knew and trusted. Some sisters dreamed at night of places they had never seen, cities described in texts, ships mentioned in passing, or markets filled with voices in languages they had never spoken. Upon waking, they did not always remember the details, only the feeling that their minds had traveled somewhere far from stone and silence. These dreams were not feared nor encouraged. They were simply part of the human mind, and the abbess taught that even in dreams, discipline could be practiced. A sister who dreamed often was advised to pray more deeply before sleep, to walk slowly in the garden, to avoid unnecessary speech. Restlessness was a kind of wind, and wind, if left unchecked, could loosen the structure of even the strongest house. There were roles within the convent that carried quiet authority, though no titles beyond sister were ever spoken aloud. The infirmarian, for instance, was not elected nor appointed, but rather grew into the role through long observation, steady hands, and a kind of listening that went deeper than words. She knew which herbs calmed pain, which cloths to place over fevered skin, and which sister needed not a tincture, but simply a hand held for a time. The scriptor, too, emerged without fanfare. Her handwriting was steady, her Latin precise. She copied scripture and commentaries with the patience of a stone carver, knowing that each error would ripple through generations, if not caught before the ink dried. In this way, the convent was less a collection of roles than a system of emergence. Strengths revealed themselves slowly, in silence, in the way a sister lingered by the garden or spent her recreation hour sketching letters in the dust with a fingertip. No one sought importance, yet every task held importance. Even the sister assigned to gather eggs each morning was aware that her work supported the entire rhythm. The yolks would enrich the bread, feed the ill, offer nourishment to the elderly who no longer had the strength for long fasts. There was no small work, only work done with attention or without. The rhythm allowed little room for indulgence, yet some sisters found small rituals that brought comfort in moments of solitude. One might collect fragments of broken pottery from the garden, arranging them on her windowsill by size or color. Another might hum quietly while folding habits, the tune never loud enough to disturb, but just enough to keep her hands moving at the right pace. These were not acts of rebellion. They were threads of individuality woven quietly into the cloth of sameness. The abbess did not forbid such things. She simply reminded them now and then that the rule was a guide, not a wall. Winter nights were long and often filled with reflection. It was during these months that memories surfaced more easily, as though the cold pulled them closer to the skin. A sister might think of her father's voice, or the feel of her mother's hands combing her hair. These thoughts came unbidden, usually during the hour of private prayer. They passed like wind beneath a door, there, then gone, but left behind a slight ache, not painful, but persistent. The abbess taught that such memories were neither sin nor virtue. They were simply part of being human. The goal was not to suppress them, but to carry them without letting them steer the heart. Sometimes a sister died without warning. No fever, no injury, only a stillness found at dawn, her candle burned to the base, her hands folded as if mid-prayer. These deaths were rare but deeply felt. The chapel would seem to echo louder the next day, each empty place a silent reminder of presence once taken for granted. The sisters did not cry openly, they did not wear black or wail, but their steps slowed, their eyes stayed lowered, and their voices, during chant, trembled slightly on the high notes. It was enough. Mourning, like everything in the convent, was measured, quiet, and folded into the rhythm. Novices feared these sudden deaths the most, not because they doubted their faith, but because they were still learning to see death as something other than an end. The older sisters carried stories of peace in dying, of final prayers whispered with a smile, of faces softened in stillness. They did not fear death, they feared distraction, that they might meet the end in a moment of complaint or forgetfulness. So they practiced attention. They folded robes with reverence. They lit candles slowly. They knelt with care. Every act became preparation, not for death, but for meeting it rightly when it arrived. In the spring, the convent welcomed new novices. They arrived shy, uncertain, often holding back tears. Some were sent by families, others had chosen for themselves. They were given robes that did not yet fit, beds that smelled of lavender and stone, and tasks that confused more than instructed. But the rhythm absorbed them, slowly, gently. The older sisters did not offer advice. They offered presence. They led by doing. They answered questions only when asked, and even then answered simply. The rhythm did not rush. It shaped the heart in its own time, like water shaping rock. Novices learned first by watching. They watched how an elder sister closed a door without sound, how she arranged candles at dusk, how she bowed her head at just the right height when entering the chapel. These were not written rules. They were absorbed, like heat from stone. A novice who asked too many questions was not corrected, but gently redirected. She would be told softly that silence taught what words could not. And so she listened. She watched. She followed the slow current of routine, and in time found her place within it. Mistakes were expected, a robe torn during cleaning, a psalm forgotten, a pot left boiling too long. These faults were not punished, but they were noticed. Correction came quietly. A sister might find the same task waiting for her the next day, a chance to do it again, this time with more care. Nothing was wasted. Even error became a part of the rhythm. The abbess reminded them that a stone, to be smooth, must be turned many times in the river's hand. The seasons shaped the work, but not the spirit. In summer, the sisters rose earlier, their hands already damp with sweat, before the sun had cleared the trees. They gathered herbs at first light, their fingers brushing soft green leaves still cool with dew. The scent of thyme, sage, and rosemary filled the garden path. Bees moved lazily between blossoms. Birds rustled in the hedges. Everything seemed to hum at a slightly quicker pace, but within the convent, time moved as it always had, measured by bells and breath and prayer. The kitchen grew warmer in these months, and the bread baked faster. The sister assigned to tend the fire used flat paddles to draw out loaves darkened at the edges. Baskets of vegetables were washed in stone basins where water trickled slowly from the pipe, cooled underground. Meals remained simple: lentils, onions, stewed greens. But now and then a gift would arrive from a nearby estate, a wheel of cheese, a jug of oil, a sack of apples, and these were divided evenly without ceremony, a slice given to each, nothing hoarded, nothing wasted. There was a joy in labor done well, though no one spoke of it. A novice might feel pride when her rows in the garden remained straight. Another might quietly admire the shine she brought to the brass candelabra. These feelings were not discouraged, but they were not nurtured either. The abbess taught that satisfaction should rest gently, like mist on morning grass, there, but never clung to. They were trained not to seek reward, but to see the work itself as the reward, that the rhythm, once entered fully, became its own form of peace. Sometimes at dusk, A few sisters were permitted to walk outside the walls in pairs, always under the eye of the portress. They would step beyond the gate and follow the path that curved behind the orchard, through the tall grass and toward the stream. These walks were short, quiet. No one wandered, no one strayed. But to feel the earth shift beneath different stones, to see trees untouched by the structure of the cloister, brought a kind of freshness to the mind. Upon return their steps slowed again, their voices softened. The rhythm held them like a gentle current. The convent never slept entirely. Even in the deepest part of the night, one sister remained awake in the chapel, keeping the vigil. She sat beside a single candle, the flame flickering against the wood of the pews. Her duty was simple: to remain alert, to pray, to ensure that not a single hour passed without attention. This vigil rotated through the sisters, each taking her turn. Some found the silence of night soothing. Others found it hard. Thoughts arrived more easily in the dark. Doubts whispered louder. But the vigil was never missed. It was a thread holding night and day together. During these hours, the convent felt like another world. Even the stone walls seemed to breathe differently. The wind carried different sounds: owls calling from the trees, branches creaking, the faint rush of water. A sister on vigil learned the shape of the night. She learned patience. She learned to pray not only with her lips, but with her stillness. And when the first bell rang before dawn, she did not feel tired. She felt returned, as if she had been watching over not just the convent, but something older, quieter, and more sacred than she had words to name. Years passed in quiet succession, each one folding neatly into the next, like the pages of a well-worn prayer book. The rhythm that had once seemed foreign to the novice became second nature. Bells that had startled her now soothed. Tasks that once confused her now guided her hands with certainty. She no longer measured time by seasons or feast days, but by the smooth repetition of duties completed and prayers whispered. The self she had brought into the convent slowly faded, not erased, but softened, reshaped into something quieter and deeper, something that listened more than it spoke. Her days began before the sun, as they always had. She rose before the first bell, not out of fear of discipline, but from habit. Her fingers moved without thought, folding her blanket, arranging her robe, placing her feet quietly on the cold floor. The air in the cell was crisp, the scent of beeswax and damp stone lingering through the early morning stillness. By the time the bell rang, she was already prepared. She joined the line of sisters moving silently toward the chapel, their steps slow and even, their minds already turning inward. The chapel felt larger with age, though its walls had not changed. Perhaps it was the way the light fell now, filtered through colored glass added during a recent renovation. Or perhaps it was the way she had learned to notice things she had once overlooked: the worn edges of the pews, the small crack near the altar stone, the echo of her voice layered atop the voices of hundreds who had come before her. Prayer was no longer something she did. It was something she inhabited, like a second skin or a cloak that covered her without effort. Her hands, once clumsy with thread and ink, now moved with quiet confidence. She knew which herbs to gather for fever, which mixture soothed aching joints, which prayers calmed a restless heart. She taught novices now, not through lectures, but through example, a glance, a pause, a repetition of gesture, the way she touched a shoulder when guiding a new sister toward patience. She did not think of herself as wise. only as one who had lived long enough to see the rhythm from both inside and above, like the pattern of a braid, viewed not just strand by strand, but as a whole. There were fewer letters now. Families changed, died, moved on. The outside world continued, but it did not pull at her heart as it once had. News came occasionally, folded in sealed parchment: the death of a king, the rise of a new order, a shift in land holdings. These events registered in her mind like distant thunder, present, but far enough that they caused no disruption. Her world was smaller, but no less real. Each brick in the cloister wall was more familiar to her than the names of distant rulers. Each face she saw at supper more known than any noble title could be. She dreamed less. Her sleep was deeper now, undisturbed by visions of cities or crowds. When dreams came, they were soft and slow, filled with gardens and candlelight and voices long past. She did not wake with longing. She woke with steadiness. Her waking hours were not filled with expectation, but with continuity. She did not seek change. She did not resist it either. She moved with the current of time, not against it. When illness came, as it eventually did, she recognized it not as a curse, but as another part of the rhythm. Her joints stiffened. Her breath grew shorter. Tasks took longer, and she found herself watching more than doing. Younger sisters brought her water, helped her to the chapel, supported her at her place in the choir. She accepted their help with grace, not shame. She had done the same for others. Now it was her turn to receive. She was not afraid. The abbess had taught her, and she had taught others in turn, that death was not a punishment. It was not even a departure. It was a return, a completion, like the last note of a chant held just long enough to fade without falling. There were no grand speeches, no final confessions shouted into the night, only a quiet evening, a candle lit, and prayers whispered as her breath slowed. A sister held her hand, another recited a psalm, and then, gently, without struggle, she stopped breathing. In the days that followed, the convent carried on. Her robes were cleaned and folded. Her cell was swept. The garden, where she had once knelt among the thyme, continued to bloom. A novice paused there one morning, brushing her fingers against a leaf she could not name. The rhythm did not break. It absorbed her passing, as it had absorbed so many others. A name added to the list, a candle lit in remembrance, a place left empty in the chapel for just one day, then filled again. To be a nun in the Middle Ages was not to escape the world, but to meet it in a different form, to turn inward without turning away, to find meaning in repetition, in silence, in devotion, given without expectation of reward. It was a life shaped not by great events, but by small acts done with care, by days that folded one into the next until a lifetime had passed, not with fanfare, but with steady breath and folded hands. A life unnoticed by history, perhaps, but not unlived, not unfelt, not forgotten.